Very glad to speak with you. I hope I can be of help. Sure. I was born to Jewish parents in London in 1920. My parents were very wealthy through banking and publishing. My parents cared about education and philanthropy and the community. It was important to them that we be good citizens of London. They wanted the best education for me. I was kind of a curious child. I loved arithmetic for fun, puzzles, things that were maybe not normal things for a child to be interested in. But I had an aunt that once remarked that I was very clever, and that even though I was somewhat odd, I was really too busy with my puzzles and my math to look up and notice what anybody thought. I went to St. Paul's Girls' School. They had a rich tradition of preparing girls for careers, and I didn't realize it at the time, but that was fairly unusual for a school to encourage girls to get an education and have their own career out in the world. I loved science and maths and hockey and cricket and lacrosse, and I was the best at almost everything I tried. I graduated from St. Paul's early and won a scholarship to study physics and chemistry at Cambridge. My parents wanted me to carry on the tradition of philanthropy and continue the Franklin Trust, but I couldn't imagine myself doing anything other than science. I just don't think I'd be of use at anything besides science. Oh. Yes, the Nazis, they were marching. I wanted to do something to help. So many people talk about how things should be done and what they think the government should do, or other people should do. But the Franklins believed in doing something right and doing what was good for themselves. The whole country was preparing for invasion. During my time at Cambridge, helping the war effort was a top priority. I created a more efficient and safer gas mask that was used by the British soldiers. We also helped find safe havens for those refugees, Jewish refugees that were coming into England. So I helped with that as well. Yes. In 1938, I went to women's college at Cambridge University. I learned about a new technique called X-ray crystallography. Because atoms are too small to be seen with a light microscope, I had to bounce X-rays off of the atoms, and then they would shoot back onto a film. And then the pattern on the film told me something about the structure of that molecule. So I became an expert in this technique, and it opened up a whole new world of things that were too small for other scientists to see. Once the war was over, and as a result of my scientific efforts, I was offered a job at one of the greatest labs in Paris. It was my dream job. I loved everything about life in Paris. The food, the people, the architecture, walking along the Seine, the fashion, the markets. I loved it all. It was here that I perfected my X-ray diffraction technique. I started to gain a professional reputation. I spoke at conferences and published in professional journals, making a name for myself. I decided to leave Paris when I was offered a highly prestigious position at King's College in London. I was hired by J.T. Randall to create an X-ray crystallography unit at King's. He wanted me to study proteins. At the time, scientists thought that proteins were the key to life. It was a more complex structure than DNA, and so they put a lot of effort into those proteins. And it wasn't until the 1940s that scientists started to even look at the structure of DNA as something with potential. So eventually, at King's, J.T. Randall, my boss, asked me to start looking at the structure of DNA. And then once it was suggested that DNA could hold the key to life, there was a great race to figure out what that structure was. Well, yes, you have to understand that in the 1950s in London, women were certainly not welcomed into the scientific community. We were only 22 years past earning the right to vote, and science was still a man's domain. Women were still expected to make motherhood and wifedom their top priorities. And that just wasn't for me, and so I was seen as odd and strange at best and sort of awful at worst. When I was hired at King's, Dr. Randall led me to believe that I would be on my own, running my own lab. I got my own assistants and started to make my own lab very efficient and successful. Dr. Wilkins was on leave, and so I got to work. When he came back, he was apparently under the impression that I would be his assistant, but that didn't really seem reasonable, did it? Because I was more qualified in X-ray crystallography than he was. I was more, I had more experience, and I was better trained. Besides, Dr. Randall had informed me that I would be on my own, though I'm not sure he clearly communicated that to Dr. Wilkins, and so that caused some tension between us. He wanted to boss me, and I didn't like being bossed. The male scientists worked together in a sort of boys' club, and I was not happy there. I wasn't allowed in the men's lunchroom, and there was not a women's bathroom in the lab. I loved the work, and that kept me going, but the atmosphere was not a supportive one. They didn't want my advice or corrections, regardless of whether they were right. They just, because I was a woman, they didn't want to hear it. It was quite absurd, actually. But I didn't need a babysitter or any new friends, so I made sure I did my work, and I asked Dr. Wilkins to give me my space. Right. Well, I was quite determined and focused in the lab, working constantly to take X-rays of DNA. At this time, a new American scientist was trying to get a job at King's, but Wilkins didn't take the bait. A young James Watson ended up at Cambridge to study the gene. He and another scientist, Francis Crick, saw one of Maurice Wilkins' early fuzzy pictures of DNA and started in on the structure of DNA. They invited us to come to view the model, and they unveiled it for the first time. They seemed quite proud of themselves, you see, but I have always put knowledge above pride. See, at this time, my images were much clearer than any others in London, or in the world, really, and I was able to correct their model. They had made some mistakes. See, they had a 3-stranded double helix, and the nitrogen bases were on the outside like leaves on a tree. So I made sure I told them that they were wrong, and they were maybe embarrassed, and I think I hurt their feelings a bit. I pointed out their mistakes, in front of others. And apparently Dr. Watson has some pretty childish tendencies, as he took my corrections very personally. We never did quite click socially after that incident, and he started calling me Rosie and the Dark Lady, which was quite annoying, really. Not long after that, Watson and Crick were told they couldn't make models anymore by their boss because of the complete failure of their first model, and then, of course, the incident. Well, my unpublished findings, notes, and images were being sneakily taken from my lab to Watson and Crick, who were using my work to make corrections on their models. I suspect Dr. Wilkins was the one taking my notes, though he never really admitted it. He says that he thinks he may have done that, but he does not remember. As they met over my stolen notes, they also gossiped like schoolgirls about how difficult and terrible I was. It was really quite childish. I was becoming more and more miserable at this very tense environment at work, and I started making plans to leave King's College. James Watson came to me once in my lab at King's, arguing that if I didn't share my work readily, another scientist, Peter Pauling, would beat us to the finish. He insisted that I help him, and that it was my duty to do so. I quite disagreed, and he became irate, shouting and becoming aggressive. My picture showed them that the sugars and phosphates swirl in opposite directions against each other, an anti-parallel double helix. I had told them that the bases were in the middle when I corrected their model. With Erwin Chargaff's findings about nitrogen bases, they were able to deduce the bases were the connecting molecules, and with William Asbury's work, they figured that bases stacked in the middle, like pennies. At first, Watson believed like bases paired with like bases, so adenine with adenine and cytosine with cytosine and so on. But his lab assistant Jerry Donahue showed him that he was using the wrong chemical forms. Then he was able to fit the bases into the framework created by me if he paired adenine with thymine and cytosine with guanine. They made a new model and needed me to come and check it. I did, and I recognized it as correct immediately. Watson seemed surprised that I didn't have any corrections. I didn't know at the time how much of my data they had needed and had stolen in order to build it. I had no idea that my work had been stolen. Wilkins showed them my Photo 51 image, the clearest of the images, and once they had what they needed, Watson and Crick published the structure of DNA, while my work was listed as a secondary source behind their work, as if my work had simply confirmed their own rather than preceding it. With my notes and images, they were able to make the necessary corrections and publish the correct structure of DNA. Oh yes, well, I didn't realize that I was an unrecognized collaborator of theirs. They all earned the Nobel Prize for their great accomplishments. Oh yes, they did warn me that I had reached dangerous levels of X-ray exposure, but the work was just too important. I didn't know how not to do science. Science was everything to me. Of course. Goodbye.